Mr. President, later this week, the Supreme Court will issue its ruling on the health care bill designed and negotiated by the White House and rammed through Congress during President Obama's first year in office when the economy was near its weakest. Instead of focusing on recovery and persistent unemployment, the President and majorities controlling Congress squandered the opportunity and forced the unpopular and potentially unconstitutional legislation on the American people. Today, we're going to vote on final passage of the reconciled FDA user fee bill. During Senate consideration of this bill, I offered an amendment to allow safe drug importation from legitimate Canadian pharmacies, but the pharmaceutical industry spread misleading and inaccurate information about the amendment, as they have done time and time again. As I said then, there is no greater example of the influence of special interests on this body than the failure to enact an amendment that would have allowed from Canadian pharmacies, or legitimate pharmacies, that people could purchase their much-needed medication at sometimes half the cost of what it is in the United States of America. And I'm embarrassed to this day that 9 of my Republican colleagues also voted against it. Now, I don't know if there was a sweetheart deal to protect pharma at the expense of American patients from the vote on my amendment. But we do know that pharma was protected by the White House and Senate Democrats from provisions they didn't like in Obamacare only after they offered up advertising exchange for more accommodating policies. From a recent House Energy and Commerce Committee investigation, it is now confirmed that pharma orchestrated a grand deal with the White House and Senate Democrats to oppose importation and other policies. I might point out, then Senator Obama supported drug importation. And this, my friends, is what happened. This is how the New York Times described the scenario as the deal that was done in exchange for reportedly $150 million in advertising to support Obamacare. This is from the New York Times. They described the scenario, June 8, 2012. After weeks of quiet talks, drug industry lobbyists were growing nervous. If they were to cut a deal with the White House on overhauling health care, they needed to be sure President Obama would stop a proposal by his liberal allies intended to bring down medicine prices. On June 3, 2009, one of the lobbyists emailed Nancy Ann DeParle, the president's top health care advisor. Ms. DeParle sent a message back reassuring the lobbyists. Although Mr. Obama was overseas, she wrote, she and other top officials, quote, made decision based on how constructive you guys have been to oppose importation on the bill, unquote. Just like that, Mr. Obama's staff abandoned his support for the reimportation of prescription drug medicines at lower prices, and with it solidified a growing compact with an industry he had vilified on the campaign trail the year before. A president who had once promised to air negotiations on C-SPAN cut a closed-door deal with a powerful pharmaceutical lobby, signifying to some disillusioned liberal supporters a loss of innocence or perhaps even the triumph of cynicism. Still, what distinguishes the Obama industry deal is that he had so strongly rejected that very sort of business as usual. Ironically, candidate Obama sang a very different tune on the campaign trail in 2008. Quote, you know, I don't want to learn how to play the game better. I want to put an end to the game playing. The New York Times article continued. The emails which the House committee obtained from PhRMA and other groups, my friends, PhRMA is a lobbying group for the pharmaceutical industry, document a tumultuous negotiation, at times transactional. Quote, and I continue to quote from the New York Times article, in the end, the White House got the support it needed to pass its broader priority, but industry emerged satisfied as well. Quote, we got a deal, unquote, wrote Bryant Hall, then senior vice president of the pharmaceutical group. In July, the White House made clear it wanted supportive ads using the same characters the industry used to defeat Mr. Clinton's proposal 15 years earlier. Quote, Rahm asked for Harry and Louise ads through third party, Mr. Hall wrote. Talks came close to breaking down several times. In May, the White House was upset that the industry had not signed on to a joint statement. One industry official wrote that they should sign, quote, Rahm is already furious. The ire will be turned on us. The emails also detail extensive and direct negotiations with PhRMA, its drug company members, the American Medical Association, AARP, the American Hospital Association, unions, and many more. Members of the alliance all participated because they thought they were getting something more valuable, revenue to their organization or membership, because the federal government was going to force everyone into some form of government-designed health insurance coverage, than what they were going to have to spend on advertising to support the legislation. Some reports have the pharma advertising commitment as high as $150 million, spread out through direct advertising in certain important states and among groups created to sound like they were looking out for patients or to tout the economic benefits of Obamacare. On June 11, 2012, the Wall Street Journal described the emails about the 2009 negotiations. The joint venture was forged in secret in spring of 2009, amid an uneasy mix of menace and opportunism. The drug makers worried that health care reform would revert to the liberal default of price controls and drug reimportation that Mr. Obama campaigned on, but they also understood that a new entitlement could be a windfall as taxpayers bought more of their products. Initially, the Obamateers and Senate Finance Chairman Max Baucus asked for $100 billion, 90% of it from mandatory rebates through the Medicare prescription drug benefit like those that are imposed in Medicaid. The drug makers wheeled him down to $80 billion by offsetting cost sharing for seniors on Medicare in an explicit quid pro quo for protection against such rebates and reimportation. Terms were reached in June. Lead pharma negotiator Brian Hall wrote on June 12th that, quote, Mr. Obama, quote, knows personally about our deal and is pushing no agenda. But Energy and Commerce Chairman Henry Waxman then announced that he was pocketing pharma's concessions and demanding more, including reimportation. We wrote about the double cross in a July 16, 2019 called Big Pharma Gets Played, unquote, noting that Mr. Tozen's corporate clients and their shareholders may soon pay for his attempt to get cozy with Obamacare. Mr. Hall forwarded the piece to Mrs. DeParley with the subject line, quote, this sucks, unquote. The White House rode to the rescue. In September, Mr. Hall informed Mr. Kendler that Deputy White House Chief of Staff Jim Messina is working on some very explicit language on importation to kill it in health care reform. This has to stay quiet. Pharma more than paid for the favor with a $150 million advertising campaign coordinated with the White House political shop, as one of Mr. Hall's deputies put it earlier in the minutes of a meeting when the deal was being negotiated. The WH-designated folks would like us to start to define what consensus health care reform means and what it might include. They definitely want us in the game and on the same side. In particular, the drug lobby would spend $70 million on two 501c4 front groups called Healthy Economy Now and Americans for Stable Quality Care. In July, Mr. Hall wrote that, quote, Rahm asked for Harry and Louise ads through third party. We've already contacted the agent. Mr. President, my statement goes on and on. It's a case of the worst kind of deal-making behind closed doors, non-transparent, getting special interest, their objectives achieved at the expense of the American people. Mr. President, the White House owes us an explanation. We need to know why Mr. Axelrod's old firm was hired to run the ads promoting Obamacare. At the time, his organization spokesman said that, but the email suggests otherwise. In email after email, the contributors refer to four men as the, quote, White House team running health care. In one email, pharma consultant Steve McMahon calls these four the White House designated folks. He explains to colleagues that Messrs. Grossman, Grislano, and Delcato are very close to Axelrod. They've been put in charge of the campaign to pass health care reform. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to put in the record a New York Times article, June 8, 2012, Wall Street Journal article, June 11, 2012, and June 21st, Wall Street Journal editorial and the memos about the emails that are associated with this report.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I know that my other colleagues are waiting to speak, but last month when we voted down this amendment to allow drug reimportation from pharmacies that are accredited by both the Canadian and American government, my statement was, and I'll repeat it, in a normal world, this would probably require a voice vote. But what we're about to see is the incredible influence of the special interests, particularly PhRMA here in Washington. So what you're about to see, as I predicted just before the vote, is the reason for the cynicism of the American people have about the way we do business in Washington. PhRMA, one of the most powerful lobbies in Washington, will exert its influence again at the expense of average low-income Americans who will again have to choose between medication and eating. And in response, the senator from New Jersey said, in opposition to my amendment, he said, it's not the special interests that have caused the Senate countless times to reject this policy. This is about the health and security of the American people. That's why time after time the Senate has rejected it. It's why it should be rejected again. And he was correct. It was rejected. The American people were rejected in favor of one of the most powerful special interest lobby in Washington, and it is a shame. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.